She was just his PA, invisible in the corporate world. Then she put on that gown. In one breathtaking moment, the most powerful man in the city was utterly captivated, his heart stolen on the spot. You won't believe the story of how this dress defied all expectations. The weight of my name had always been enough to silence a room. One mention of Stephen Harrison and deals shifted. Competitors flinched, markets trembled. Yet beneath that polished surface of dominance and certainty was a gnawing reminder that all my power was still fragile in the eyes of society. Power without stability was nothing. A man without a woman by his side was still deemed incomplete. And with Franklin's wedding just days away, a gathering of investors, rivals, and vultures, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I could not show up alone. I sat in my office, the skyline glittering like shards of glass through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and rubbed a hand across my face. The whispers had grown louder in recent weeks. He's brilliant but reckless, too detached, too cold. Maybe he doesn't know how to love. They didn't understand that my distance wasn't ignorance. It was armor. But armor doesn't photograph well at galas or weddings, and I could already picture Landry's smug face if I dared step into that ballroom without a date. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder, Franklin's rehearsal dinner. The thought of walking in alone twisted something in my chest, a rare discomfort. I needed someone. Not someone dazzling or loud, but someone who could quiet the noise without saying a word. My mind, stubborn as ever, refused the idea of hiring an escort or dragging along one of the empty-faced socialites who'd been hovering at my side. I wanted someone I could trust, someone who wouldn't crumble under 1,000 judging eyes. My gaze slid across the office, landing on the woman who had become the backbone of my empire without ever stepping into the spotlight. Charlie sat hunched over her desk, sleeves rolled, hair pulled back, sorting through a mountain of contracts like the fate of the world depended on her precision. She didn't belong to my world of marble ballrooms and ruthless smiles, and yet she did. She belonged everywhere, though she refused to see it. The words slipped out before I had the chance to censor them. "Charlize." She looked up, startled, as if I'd pulled her from a dream. Her eyes, always steady, always too knowing, fixed on me. "Yes, Mr. Harrison?" I hesitated, then forced myself forward. "Come with me to Franklin's wedding, as my date." Her pen froze. The smallest furrow appeared between her brows. "Your date?" "Yes." My tone was clipped, as though confidence could disguise the absurdity of the request. "You're the only one I trust not to embarrass me, and I need someone by my side." For a moment, silence stretched between us. I expected laughter or a flat refusal. But Charlize wasn't the type to laugh at power. She set her pen down, folding her hands with careful restraint. "Mr. Harrison, that's not my world. I wouldn't fit in." Something tightened in me. She was wrong. She fit in everywhere, though she didn't know it. "You'll do fine. Just be there." Her lips parted, then closed. She nodded slowly, though doubt flickered across her face. If that's what you want, it was. And yet it wasn't. The truth lodged in my throat. I didn't just need her to fill a role. I wanted her there because something about her steadied me in ways even I didn't understand. The night of the wedding arrived too quickly. I wore my power like a second skin, tailored black suit, watch gleaming, mask of composure perfected. But the moment I stepped into the ballroom, I felt the weight of eyes. Investors, rivals, the press, all of them ready to dissect me. My chest tightened, anticipation coiling like a spring. Then she walked in. Charlize. The room shifted around her as if the air itself had bent in deference. Her gown was midnight silk, clinging in all the right places, her hair loose and shining like liquid fire beneath the chandeliers. She wasn't the quiet assistant anymore, scribbling notes in the shadow of my empire. She was a woman who could own the very room I had spent years dominating. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Even Paulina, the predator of social circles, blinked in sharp surprise. My throat went dry. words dying before they reached my tongue. I had told myself she would be a placeholder, a convenient distraction. But one look at her and the carefully constructed walls I had spent years building cracked. Her eyes found mine across the ballroom. For a fleeting second, the world narrowed until it was just us. Her lips parted, uncertain, as though she couldn't believe she belonged there. And God help me, I wanted to tell her she belonged more than anyone else in the room. Franklin clapped me on the shoulder, laughing, saying something about finally showing up with someone who wasn't a stock certificate, but his words blurred into noise. I couldn't stop looking at her, my PA, my lifeline, and now, the woman who had stolen the breath from my lungs with a single step. I approached her slowly, every stride deliberate, like prey circling the most dangerous temptation of my life. "Charlize," I murmured, offering my hand. She took it hesitantly, her fingers trembling just enough for me to feel. "Thank you for coming." The words felt inadequate, hollow compared to the storm inside me. Her lashes lowered, her voice quiet. "You insisted." "Yes," I admitted, my voice low enough that only she could hear. "But I didn't know it would be like this." Her brow arched, the faintest spark of challenge in her eyes. "Like what?" "Like falling." I swallowed the truth, pressing it back into the cage of my ribs. But it was too late. My world, once perfectly ordered, had shifted the moment she stepped into that gown. And I knew with bone-deep certainty, nothing would ever be the same again. The music of the ballroom swelled around them, golden light spilling from the chandeliers in a wash of warmth that could not soften the scrutiny of the crowd. Stephen Harrison stood with Charlize at his side, outwardly composed, inwardly unraveling. Power had always been his weapon, his shield, the invisible cloak that set him apart from ordinary men. But in that moment, with her presence grounding him and unsettling him all at once, Stephen felt the unfamiliar stir of vulnerability. He had lived years believing that love was nothing more than a distraction, a luxury for those who had the time to indulge in it. Deals, mergers, acquisitions. That was reality. Bonds could be broken, vows shattered, but contracts, those endured. Yet as he watched Charlize navigate the stares and whispers of strangers with quiet grace, the edges of that conviction wavered. Charlize kept her chin lifted, though her pulse thrummed like a drumbeat beneath her skin. She had grown up learning to shrink, to take up as little space as possible in a world that rewarded silence. Yvonne, her sister, had always been the one who urged her to step into the light, to remember she was more than a shadow clinging to the edges of someone else's story. And yet here she was, in a room filled with glittering gowns and sharp smiles, standing beside the most powerful man in the city. Every gaze felt like a dagger, some filled with curiosity, others with contempt. But Stephen's hand, lightly brushing her arm, steadied her. He didn't know it, but to her that gesture was both anchor and storm. Across the room, Franklin caught sight of them, his grin wide as he excused himself from a cluster of laughing guests. He clasped Stephen's shoulder with easy familiarity, unbothered by the weight of the crowd's stares. "About time you brought someone worth meeting," Franklin teased, his voice pitched just loud enough for those nearby to catch. He turned to Charlize, his expression softening. "And you must be the miracle worker who keeps his empire from collapsing." Charlize flushed, startled by his direct kindness. "I just do my job." "Don't be modest," Franklin said warmly, shaking her hand. "If you've managed him this long, you deserve a medal, not just a paycheck." Stephen's lips twitched, the faintest ghost of a smile, though he said nothing. He rarely let emotions slip in public, but Charlize noticed. She always noticed. Not everyone welcomed her so easily. From the far end of the ballroom, Paulina glided forward, her gown a cascade of crimson silk that shimmered like fire. She was elegance incarnate, every step calculated, every smile designed to conquer. Her eyes lingered on Stephen with practiced familiarity, before flicking toward Charlize, cool and dismissive. "Well," Paulina purred, her voice laced with honey and venom, "I didn't expect you to finally bring a companion, Stephen. And here I thought you preferred solitude." Charlize felt the sting in the woman's tone, but kept her composure, though the words settled heavily in her chest. She had been dismissed before, branded invisible in countless ways, but in this glittering hall the dismissal carried sharper teeth. Stephen's reply was swift, his voice firm enough to silence nearby whispers. "Charlize is not just a companion, Paulina. She's the one person I can trust to stand beside me." The crowd shifted, murmurs rising. Paulina's smile faltered before she masked it with feigned amusement. "Trust," she echoed softly, tilting her head. "What a rare thing for a man like you." Landry, lurking nearby with a glass of champagne he had barely touched, observed the exchange with a predator's patience. His mind was already working, cataloging the vulnerability in Stephen's words, the surprise in the room, the way gossip rippled like wildfire. Landry had always been waiting for a fracture in Stephen's untouchable facade, and tonight he smelled blood in the water. Charlize, oblivious to Landry's scrutiny, focused on holding her place at Stephen's side. She had told herself that she could endure a single evening of whispers and judgment, that her role was simply to support him. But as the night deepened, her admiration for him sharpened into something more complicated. She had worked beside Stephen for years, seen him at his most ruthless, his most unyielding. But here, beneath the weight of expectation and scrutiny, she glimpsed something else. A man whose loneliness was carved into the set of his jaw, whose isolation was disguised beneath impeccable tailoring and icy stares. Stephen felt it too. He told himself the tug in his chest was nothing but curiosity, the shock of seeing her transformed. But as he listened to her quiet laughter at something Franklin said, as he noticed the way she steadied her breathing to endure the stares, the lie rang hollow. Something about her presence unsettled him, loosened the iron grip he had maintained on himself for so long. The orchestra shifted into a slower tune, and Franklin excused himself to rejoin his bride. Paulina drifted back into the crowd, her eyes glittering with plans. Landry leaned against a marble pillar, watching. And in that moment, the mystery began to take root. An unspoken sense that someone here intended to use this night against him. Stephen felt it as a prickle down his spine, an awareness honed by years of battling rivals. The enemy wasn't visible yet, but the scent of danger hung in the air. Charlize leaned slightly closer, her voice a whisper. "Are you all right?" Stephen's gaze snapped to hers, surprised. Few ever asked, few ever noticed. He forced a small nod. "Always." But it wasn't true. For the first time, standing with her, he wondered if his world was not as unshakable as he had believed. And the realization unsettled him more than any hostile takeover ever could. The night stretched on, a blur of laughter, whispers, and the unspoken tension that coiled between them. Charlize carried herself with quiet dignity, though inside she warred with doubt. She had admired him in silence for years, never daring to imagine a place at his side. Yet here she was, caught in a moment that felt dangerously like a dream. Stephen wrestled with his own contradictions. He had always dismissed love as weakness, but every glance at Charlize chipped away at the foundation of that belief. He was a man built on certainty, and yet with her, nothing felt certain anymore. And somewhere in the shadows, Landry's smirk deepened. The ballroom glittered like a universe contained within four walls, chandeliers dripping with light, tables adorned with crystal and gold. Voices swirled in a tide of laughter and speculation, each one measured and sharpened for society's endless game. Stephen Harrison stood tall, his posture betraying none of the unease stirring inside him. Beside him, Charlize kept her shoulders straight, though her heart thudded like a frantic drum against her ribs. For a time, it felt as though they had found a rhythm. Franklin's warm greeting had soothed some of the sharp edges of doubt in Charlize's chest. She had endured the curious glances, even the veiled whispers. Stephen's quiet reassurance, his steady presence, was a shield she had never expected. But a room like this was never kind for long. Paulina approached again, her crimson gown trailing behind her like a flame. She wore her beauty as a weapon, her smile as a blade, and her words as poison. When she stopped before them, her eyes swept Charlize from head to toe, pausing at the gown that had drawn every gaze earlier. "How interesting," Paulina said, her tone dripping with mockery. "Stephen Harrison, of all men, has finally brought someone into the light. And who would have guessed?" Her gaze narrowed on Charlize, icy and disdainful. His personal assistant, just a PA. The words cracked across the marble hall like a whip. Conversations faltered. Guests leaned closer, hungry for the unfolding spectacle. Charlize froze, her hands curling into her palms. The sting was sharp, not because it was new. She had lived her life being overlooked, undervalued, but because this time the humiliation unfolded before the eyes of an entire ballroom. Stephen's jaw clenched. For years he had let such moments pass, preferring silence to confrontation. But not tonight. Not with Charlize standing there, absorbing the cruelty meant to diminish her. He turned to Paulina, his voice slicing through the murmurs. "Watch your tongue." The crowd hushed. Even the orchestra faltered before recovering, soft notes carrying uneasily. Stephen's stare was unyielding, his tone laced with steel. "Charlize is the reason I stand where I do today. She's the one person I can rely on. She is not just a PA. She is indispensable." A ripple passed through the guests. Paulina's smile wavered before she quickly masked it with feigned amusement, though her eyes betrayed the flash of humiliation. Charlize felt the ground tilt beneath her. The words burned in her chest, not for their sharpness, but for their defense. No one had ever spoken of her like that. She blinked rapidly, fighting to maintain composure. Paulina gave a stiff laugh and swept away, though her pride smoldered like ash in her wake. But the damage, or perhaps the spark, was already done. The ballroom buzzed with new whispers. Stephen Harrison had defended his assistant, publicly, fiercely. And the eyes that lingered on Charlize now held not just curiosity, but speculation. In the shadows, Landry leaned closer to his companion. His lips curved into a wolfish smile. "Perfect," he murmured. His gaze tracked Stephen and Charlize, noting the tremor in her hand, the fire in Stephen's voice. "Let them wonder. I'll give them reason." Within moments, the whispers thickened like smoke. Landry had set them aflame. A rumor spread that Stephen's presence with Charlize was no accident, no whim, but a cover. That she was here to distract from some hidden scandal, that perhaps Stephen had been reckless with investments or worse, entangled in something shameful. The details were vague, shifting, but the poison was planted. Charlize, unaware of the exact origin but sensing the storm, felt the eyes sharpen against her back. She leaned closer to Stephen, her voice trembling. "They're staring more." "I know," Stephen said evenly, though a storm brewed beneath his calm. He could not lash out, not yet. He could not silence whispers with contracts, but what he could do was keep her close, shield her with presence. The orchestra shifted again, violins rising into a slower, richer melody. Couples began to drift toward the dance floor, silk and satin swirling like petals in motion. Franklin led his bride, laughter in their eyes, and others followed, eager to display poise under the chandelier light. Stephen looked at Charlize. Her lips parted as if to protest before he even spoke, but he offered his hand anyway, his gaze unwavering. "Dance with me." Her throat tightened. I don't think you can." His hand didn't waver. "Trust me." For a long moment, she stared at him, torn between fear and something far more dangerous. Then, with a breath she barely realized she took, she placed her hand in his. The moment their palms met, a current sparked between them, subtle yet undeniable. Stephen guided her onto the dance floor, their steps folding into the rhythm as though they had rehearsed for years. Charles's pulse roared in her ears. His hand rested firm against her back, his other clasping hers with steady confidence. The nearness was intoxicating, overwhelming. She had spent years memorizing the curve of his voice, the sharpness of his focus, but she had never imagined the heat of his touch, the weight of his gaze. Stephen was equally undone. He had thought her beautiful when she stepped into the ballroom, but here, in his arms, she was devastating. Her eyes lifted to his, wide and uncertain, yet glowing with something unspoken. Each step drew him deeper into the realization that he was no longer steering this evening. She was. Around them, whispers burned hotter. Paulina's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed tight as she watched from the edge of the crowd. Landry smirked, already weaving threads of suspicion. Franklin, though, smiled knowingly, as though he had seen this moment long before Stephen had allowed himself to. The music slowed, their bodies closer than they should have been. For a fleeting second, Stephen forgot the ballroom, the investors, the weight of his name. All that existed was her, Charlize, trembling but radiant, her breath mingling with his. Her lips parted, as if to speak, but the words died. Stephen's gaze dropped just briefly to her mouth. Desire lanced through him, sharp and sudden. He pulled back slightly, forcing air between them, though the decision cost him. The song ended. Applause filled the air, but Stephen barely registered it. He released her hand only to place it firmly on her arm, keeping her close as they returned to the edge of the floor. The decision had already formed in his mind, crystallizing with a clarity that startled him. He would not distance himself from her. He would not explain her away. Stephen Harrison, for the first time in his carefully controlled life, had chosen something not for appearances, not for power, but for himself. He would keep Charlize by his side, not as an accessory, not as a shield, but as the woman who had shaken the ground beneath him. And as Landry's rumor twisted deeper into the crowd, as Paulina's fury sharpened into resolve, the stakes rose higher. The ballroom no longer held just music and laughter. It held battle lines, drawn silently between rivals and secrets. Charlize didn't know it yet, but the night had already set her life on a course she could never turn back from. What would you have done in Charlize's place? Walked away from the humiliation, or stood your ground beside Stephen? Tell us in the comments. The days following Franklin's wedding blurred into a new kind of battlefield. The ballroom confrontation had planted a seed in every guest's mind, and that seed sprouted into rumor before the night was over. Stephen Harrison, the untouchable billionaire, had defended his assistant, danced with her, and chosen to keep her close. The world noticed, and it did not intend to forget. Charlize should have returned to her desk, back to the safety of schedules, contracts, and invisibility. But Stephen didn't allow it. Each morning that week, he instructed her to accompany him, not just as an assistant, but as his date, his partner in a parade of luncheons, investor gatherings, and private dinners where alliances were forged and broken. At first, Charlize resisted. "This isn't my place," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the polished floor of his office. "I don't belong at those tables." Stephen leaned against the edge of his desk, arms folded, his gaze steady. "You belong everywhere I decide you do, and I decide you're coming." There was no arguing with his tone, but what unsettled her wasn't his command. It was the glimmer of something more beneath it, something that made her pulse quicken, though she told herself it was only nerves. The first event was a luncheon overlooking the city. Landry sat at the far end of the table, his smile sharp, his voice louder than necessary as he hinted at Stephen's supposed recklessness. Paulina arrived draped in pearls, her laughter tinkling like glass as she leaned across the table to slice Charlize with words sweetened by charm. "And you, Charlize," Paulina said, her lips curving as she set down her champagne flute. "You must find it overwhelming, stepping into a world like this. Not many would have the nerve to sit where you sit now." Don't you agree, Landry? Landry chuckled, eyes glinting. It does take a certain resilience. But then again, Stephen's always been unconventional in his choices. The table erupted with polite laughter, the kind that carried more edge than mirth. Charlize lowered her gaze, cheeks warming, but before silence could settle, Stephen's voice cut through. She's here because she's earned it, he said, his fork poised with calm precision. If anyone at this table doubts her ability to contribute, they're welcome to test it. The weight of his words landed with force. The laughter died. Paulina's lips tightened into a smile too brittle to be real. Landry leaned back, watching, calculating. Charlize said nothing, but beneath the table her hands curled into fists. For the first time, she wondered if she could stand her ground in this world, not just because Stephen demanded it, but because she might actually belong. That night, after the luncheon, she stayed late at Stephen's penthouse, going over contracts and damage control strategies. The city stretched out in glittering silence beyond the glass walls. You don't have to stay, Stephen said, loosening his tie as he walked toward the window. You asked me to be your shield this week, she murmured without looking up from the papers. I'm not about to fail now. A small silence followed, filled only by the faint hum of the city below. Then softly he said, You've never failed me, Charlize. Her heart stuttered. She looked up, startled, meeting his gaze. For once, there was no wall between them, no armor of sarcasm or power, just raw honesty. The moment stretched, fragile and charged. She looked away first, her pulse racing. We should finish these before the morning. But the tremor in her voice betrayed her, and Stephen, though he said nothing, felt the truth settle in his chest like a weight he both feared and craved. The following days brought more battles. Paulina and Landry, united by spite, spread whispers like wildfire. They suggested Charlize was unfit, a liability, that Stephen's judgment was clouded. At one dinner, Paulina leaned close enough for Charlize to hear and murmured, Men like him always get bored, dear. Don't mistake convenience for permanence. Charlize clenched her jaw, refusing to react. But later, in the car, her silence spoke louder than words. You heard her, Stephen said, watching her reflection in the dark window. I've heard worse, she replied, her tone clipped. His hand tightened on the steering wheel. You shouldn't have to. She turned her head then, meeting his eyes. But I do, because I chose to stand beside you this week, and I'll keep choosing it. Her words unsettled him more than Paulina's poison ever could. By midweek, the gossip had reached investors. Landry capitalized on it, whispering doubts in ears eager for scandal. Deals Stephen thought secure began to wobble. The air around him thickened with tension, each handshake laced with suspicion. But through it all, Charlize remained steady. She absorbed glances meant to cut, endured questions meant to humiliate, and when Stephen faltered, she steadied him with a quiet word or a look that said she believed in him even when the world didn't. One night, after a grueling investor dinner where Landry nearly cornered him, Stephen and Charlize returned to his penthouse. The hour was late, exhaustion weighing heavy, yet neither moved to retreat. Instead, they found themselves standing near the window again, the city sprawling endlessly beneath them. You shouldn't have to fight my battles, Stephen said quietly. Charlize shook her head. They're not just your battles anymore. He looked at her then, really looked, at the way her hair had come loose, at the tired determination in her eyes. He realized, with a clarity that shook him, that her strength had become his own. She was no longer just part of his empire's foundation. She was its heart. And Charlize, meeting his gaze, realized something just as terrifying. She didn't have to live small anymore. She didn't have to hide in shadows, accepting invisibility. With him, she had been thrust into the light, and instead of shrinking, she found herself standing taller than ever. The tension between them deepened with every passing day, a pull that neither could deny. Late-night strategy sessions turned into moments of stolen glances, banter softening into something warmer. The air between them grew charged, each silence heavy with unspoken questions. Paulina and Landry redoubled their efforts, their whispers sharpening into daggers. But the more they attacked, the more Stephen admired the way Charlize carried herself with quiet defiance. And the more Charlize endured, the more she began to believe that perhaps she had been wrong all along about her place in his world. By the end of the week, nothing between them was the same. The world saw scandal, weakness, distraction. But Stephen saw strength. He saw the woman who stood beside him not because she had to, but because she chose to. And Charlize saw a man who, for all his walls and armor, was beginning to let her in. Do you think Charlize should keep standing her ground in Stephen's world despite the gossip? Or would you have walked away? Share your thoughts. The week of investor events had passed like a gauntlet, and though Stephen Harrison held his composure through every test, he carried the weight of each glance, each whisper, each subtle cut aimed at Charlize. She had endured them all with quiet strength, never faltering, never asking for reprieve. And still, as the nights grew later and their silences deeper, a shift began to tremble between them, fragile yet undeniable. It was late when they returned from another dinner. The city pulsed outside the penthouse windows, lights shimmering like restless stars. Stephen discarded his jacket, his shoulders tense from the endless pressure of appearances. Charlize lingered by the glass wall, her reflection framed against the skyline, her gown clinging to her as though the night itself had wrapped her in its arms. "You don't have to keep doing this," Stephen said suddenly, his voice rough. Charlize turned, startled. "Doing what?" "This." He gestured vaguely, though the meaning was sharp. "Enduring their stares, their whispers, their cruelty. I didn't ask you to be my shield." Her eyes softened, though her chin lifted with quiet defiance. "You didn't have to. I chose to." The words disarmed him more than he cared to admit. He had built his life on control, on calculated moves, on never allowing someone else's choice to shake his balance. And yet, here she was, choosing him again and again. Not because of power, not because of obligation, but simply because she wanted to. He turned away, pacing to the bar, pouring a drink he didn't taste. "You don't know what it means to be tied to me, Charlize. To stand this close for too long. It corrodes people. It leaves them broken." Her brows knit. "You don't believe that. Not really." He laughed once, bitter and short. "I believe it because I watched it happen. My parents, do you know what destroyed them? Love. Or at least, what they thought it was. I watched their marriage unravel like a contract with no binding clause. Promises meant nothing. Affection meant less. And when it was over, all that remained was ruin. I swore I would never let myself become that weak." Silence followed, heavy and raw. Charlize stared at him, the mask of certainty stripped from his words, leaving behind the boy who had once learned that trust was dangerous, that attachment was fatal. Slowly, she stepped toward him. "Stephen, I grew up being told I would never be more than what I am, that I'd serve men like you, clean up their messes, hold their secrets, but never stand as their equal. Do you know what it's like to be invisible in every room you enter? To have your worth measured by how small you can make yourself?" Her voice trembled, but she didn't falter. "I believed it for so long, that I was nothing more than a servant to someone else's world. But this week, standing beside you, even when they laughed, even when they tried to humiliate me, I realized I was wrong. I'm not invisible. I'm not small. And you—" Her voice broke, soft but fierce. "You're the only reason I believe that now." Stephen's breath caught. The air between them thickened, charged with something too powerful to name. He turned, meeting her gaze, and for once he didn't look away. Her hand lifted, hesitant, brushing his sleeve as though she had no right to touch him. But that single touch cracked the dam inside him. In 2 strides, he closed the space between them, his hand catching her wrist, his eyes burning into hers. "Charlize!" His voice was a warning, a plea, a confession all at once. Then he kissed her. It wasn't polished or careful. not the calculated control he wore like armor. It was raw, desperate, a collision of two people who had circled the edge of fire for too long. Her gasp melted into him, her fingers clutching his shirt as though she might fall without him. His hand pressed against the small of her back, pulling her closer, grounding himself in the reality of her. For a moment, the world ceased to exist. No investors, no rivals, no whispers. Just the taste of her, the heat of her, the terrifying, undeniable truth that he needed her more than he had ever allowed himself to need anyone. When they broke apart, breathless, Stephen staggered back as though the moment had struck him down. His chest heaved, his hands trembling despite his effort to still them. "This is exactly why I shouldn't have let you in," he said hoarsely, though his eyes betrayed the hunger still burning there. This weakness. Charles's throat tightened, but she stood tall. "If this is weakness, then maybe you've been strong for too long." The words lingered like an echo in his chest, tearing through the foundations he had lived by. But before either of them could find a way to move forward, the world moved against them. The next morning, headlines lit up across the networks. Landry's whisper campaign had transformed into something far more dangerous. Leaked documents appeared online, falsified contracts, altered signatures that painted Charles as a manipulator, a woman who had climbed her way into Stephen's life by orchestrating deals in her favor. "Assistant exploits CEO," the headlines screamed. "Harrison's empire compromised by scandal." Investors began pulling out. Phone calls poured in, one after another, demanding explanations. The empire that Stephen had built on precision and control now teetered on the edge of collapse, and at the center of it all was Charlize. Stephen slammed the folder of printed documents onto his desk, his jaw set in fury. Landry. It has to be him. He planted this. Charlize stood across the room, pale and stricken. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edges of the chair, her voice barely a whisper. "They'll never believe me. Not against evidence like that." Stephen turned to her, his expression fierce. "I'll make them believe you. I'll tear him apart." But beneath the fire, fear gnawed at him. He had already let the world see too much. He had kissed her. He had let himself want her. And now the one woman he couldn't lose had been turned into the very weapon meant to destroy him. Charlize met his gaze, her eyes filled with both strength and sorrow. "Stephen, what if they're right? What if I'm the reason you lose everything?" His heart lurched. He crossed the room, taking her face in his hands, his voice rough with conviction. "No. You're the reason I finally have something worth losing." But even as he said it, the walls of his empire trembled and the choice before them loomed darker than ever. Do you think Stephen should risk everything to defend Charlize, even if it means his empire crumbles? What would you do in his place? The storm broke on a Friday morning. The headlines screamed across every screen, every feed, every whispered conversation in the financial district. Stephen Harrison's assistant exposed, romance and corruption. Photos of Charles, taken without permission at Franklin's wedding, plastered beside forged documents that Landry's people had seeded in the press. The narrative was brutal and merciless. She wasn't indispensable. She wasn't loyal. She was an opportunist, a gold digger who had seduced her way into the center of an empire to manipulate it from within. Charlize sat frozen at her desk, the words searing into her skin like brands. Her phone buzzed with messages she didn't want to read, half pity, half venom. Colleagues who once relied on her steady hand now avoided her gaze. By noon, camera crews gathered outside the building, shouting questions about her supposed betrayal. Stephen stormed into the office, his face carved from stone, his presence commanding silence from everyone he passed. He threw the newspaper onto her desk, his voice low and taut with rage. "This is a lie!" Her eyes lifted, wide and wounded. "But they believe it!" "They'll believe what I tell them to," he snapped, though even he could hear the hollowness of the promise. His world had been built on certainty, on control. But this scandal, cut through the one place he hadn't guarded. For a moment, they just stared at each other, his jaw tight, her hands trembling. Then he turned away, pacing, fists clenched. "I need time to think," he muttered, as though the weight of her gaze was too much. And in that hesitation, the damage was done. By evening, Landry stood on television, smirking as he discussed the tragedy of seeing someone so brilliant fall prey to manipulation. Investors began pulling funds. Partnerships Stephen had secured for years suddenly shifted, looking for safer ground. Every moment Stephen didn't speak in Charlize's defense was another nail driven into her coffin. That night, the two of them attended a gala Stephen couldn't cancel without sending the market into further chaos. The ballroom gleamed with chandeliers, but the light felt cruel, exposing every shadow. Whispers swirled like smoke, eyes darted toward them, and laughter followed in their wake. Paulina appeared in front of them, her expression dripping false pity. "Oh, Stephen," she cooed, her gaze sliding toward Charlize. "It's such a shame when loyalty turns to greed, but surely you'll recover. Men like you always do." Charlize felt her heart twist. She waited for Stephen to cut Paulina down, to defend her as fiercely as he once had. But he said nothing. His lips parted, closed again, his silence more damning than any accusation. The humiliation scorched Charlize's cheeks. She turned sharply, her heels clicking against marble as she fled into the night air. The cold bit her skin, but it couldn't numb the pain inside her chest. Stephen found her outside minutes later, standing beneath a streetlight, her gown shimmering with tears she hadn't meant to shed. He reached for her arm, but she flinched away. "You didn't say anything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not one word." His throat worked, but the truth clawed its way out. I froze. I couldn't what?" she demanded, spinning toward him. "Couldn't admit that I mattered? Couldn't risk looking weak?" He faltered, every defense he had built failing him under the fire in her eyes. "I didn't want to make it worse." Her laugh was soft and broken. "You already did." She pulled the thin chain of her ID badge from her neck, the one thing that tethered her to his empire, and pressed it into his hand. "I can't do this anymore, not like this." "Charlize!" His voice cracked, desperate, but she shook her head. "You said once that love was weakness. Maybe you were right, because right now, loving you feels like the most foolish thing I've ever done." Her words shattered him, but before he could reply, she turned and walked into the night, her silhouette dissolving into the crowd. Back inside, Stephen stood alone as the gala carried on, its glittering music and laughter now a cruel backdrop to the devastation hollowing him out. He clenched the badge in his hand until the chain bit into his skin, the tiny object heavier than any empire he had ever built. The days that followed were a blur of collapse. Investors withdrew completely. Landry circled like a vulture, and every news outlet replayed Charlize's image as though she were a criminal. Stephen fought, but his focus fractured, his rage barely concealing the emptiness beneath. Every office felt colder without her presence, every contract less certain, every victory meaningless. At night, his penthouse became a tomb. He stood by the window where she had once stood, her reflection mingling with the city lights, and all he saw now was emptiness. The silence pressed against him until it was unbearable. Stephen Harrison had everything: wealth, power, reputation. But as the city buzzed below, he realized he had nothing that mattered. For the first time in his life, he was truly, utterly alone. And it was all his fault. If you were Charlize, would you have walked away after Stephen's silence, or would you have stayed to fight beside him despite the betrayal? Tell us in the comments. The days after Charlize's departure stretched into an endless haze for Stephen Harrison. His empire, once a fortress of certainty, trembled under the weight of scandal. Meetings dragged on with investors demanding answers, and though he gave them numbers, assurances, promises of stability, none of it carried the strength it once had. Every boardroom felt colder. Every office felt emptier. And every night, when silence pressed against the walls of his penthouse, it was her absence that echoed most loudly. He hadn't touched her resignation letter at first. He'd left it on his desk, a white envelope edged in finality, too painful to confront. But as days turned to weeks and the sting of her departure deepened, his eyes returned to it again and again until one night he finally opened it. Her handwriting was neat, steady, typical Charlize, careful even in heartbreak. "Mr. Harrison," it began formally, though the words carried tremors beneath their composure. "I can no longer stand in a place where my presence harms more than it helps. I resign effective immediately. I only ask one thing before I go, that you remember there was someone who saw you. Not the CEO, not the empire, just you, even if it was only once." Stephen read it once, twice, 3 times. By the 4th, his hands shook, the words blurring as his chest tightened painfully. She had seen him, when no one else ever had, and he had thrown it away in his silence. He sank into his chair, clutching the letter like it was the last tether to air. For all his wealth, for all his carefully calculated moves, he had let his fear carve out the one thing he needed most. When the knock came at his door, he almost ignored it, but the sound persisted, soft, yet steady. With a sigh, he opened it and found Yvonne standing there. Her resemblance to Charlize was undeniable, though where Charlize carried quiet resilience, Yvonne radiated warmth and fire. "May I come in?" she asked gently. Stephen stepped aside without a word. She entered, her eyes sweeping the sterile penthouse, lingering on the untouched glass of scotch on the counter, the resignation letter still trembling in his grip. "You've lost her," Yvonne said softly, though not without steel. Stephen's throat tightened. "I know. And you think sitting here with that letter will bring her back?" He looked away, the weight of guilt heavy in his chest. "She deserved better than what I gave her. I couldn't even defend her when she needed me most." Yvonne studied him for a long moment, then crossed the room, her gaze unflinching. "Do you know what my sister told me the night she agreed to be your date? She said you didn't see her. Not really. That to you she was just another cog in your machine. But she went anyway because some part of her hoped she was wrong. And when you defended her at the wedding, she came home shaking, Stephen. Not because of fear, but because it was the first time she believed she mattered to you." Her voice caught slightly, then steadied. "She believed in you. Always. Even when no one else did." Stephen's chest ached, his grip on the letter tightening until the paper crumpled. "And I failed her anyway." "Then don't fail her again," Yvonne said firmly. "If you want her back, fight for her. Not with your empire. Not with your money. With you." The words struck him like lightning. He had spent his life wielding power as armor, wealth as proof, but none of it had kept Charlize. None of it had made her stay. What she had asked for, what she had thanked him for, was something he had given only once and then buried again. Himself. That night, he stood before the window where he and Charlize had once shared their most vulnerable confessions. The city shimmered beyond, but for once, he didn't feel taller than it. He felt small, human, breakable. And for the first time, he let that truth settle without shame. The next morning, he arrived at his office not in his usual armor of dark suits and rehearsed certainty, but stripped of his mask. His staff noticed it, the rawness in his gaze, the absence of walls. Instead of diving into numbers and strategies, he asked for Charlize's last known address. "Sir," his assistant began cautiously, "there's media there. It might—" "I don't care," Stephen said simply. Hours later, he found himself outside a modest apartment building on the quieter side of the city. Cameras lingered across the street, hoping to catch another glimpse of the fallen CEO, but Stephen ignored them. He climbed the stairs, his pulse unsteady, the resignation letter still in his pocket like a confession. When the door opened, Yvonne stood there again. She studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside without a word. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and lavender. Charlize sat at a small kitchen table, papers spread before her as she worked on something ordinary, her hair falling loose around her face. She looked up, shock flashing across her features before she quickly masked it. "Stephen," she said flatly, her voice careful. "What are you doing here?" He took a step forward, then another, until he stood in the small space that felt more alive than his penthouse ever had. He pulled the letter from his pocket, placing it on the table between them. "I read it," he said quietly, "and it broke me." Charlize's lips parted, but no words came. He drew a shaky breath. "You said you saw me once. The truth is, you've always seen me. And I was too much of a coward to admit I saw you too. Not the assistant, not the shield, you. And I let fear keep me silent when the world tried to tear you down. I will regret that for the rest of my life." Her eyes glistened, but she turned her face away, struggling to steady her breath. "It doesn't change what happened. You froze, Stephen. You proved every whisper right." "I know," he said hoarsely. "But I can't lose you, Charlize. Not like this. Not because I was afraid. If I fight for you now, it won't be with contracts or with money. It will be with the one thing I should have given you from the beginning. Me." The room fell silent, the city's noise distant beyond the thin walls. For a moment, Charlize just stared at him, torn between anger and longing, fear and hope. Her heart ached with the memory of his silence, but the raw vulnerability in his eyes struck something deeper. For the first time, Stephen Harrison wasn't the untouchable billionaire. He was a man stripped bare, begging not for victory, but for love. Charlize drew a trembling breath, her voice breaking. "If I let you back in, Stephen, you can't freeze again. Not ever." His gaze held hers, unwavering. "I won't. I swear it." And though the road ahead still bristled with obstacles, the shift had begun. Hope flickered in the ashes of despair, fragile but alive. Stephen Harrison had made his decision. He would fight for Charlize, not as an empire, but as a man who had finally learned what it meant to love. Do you believe people can truly change when love forces them to face their deepest fears? Would you give Stephen another chance if you were Charlize? The grand hall glittered with crystal and light, a palace of wealth where reputations were secured and destroyed in a single night. It was the annual Investor Gala, the very stage Landry had been waiting for, and Paulina at his side gleamed like a blade dressed in silk. Every glance, every whisper had been orchestrated. This was their chance to drive the final stake into Stephen Harrison's empire. Stephen arrived later than usual, the weight of expectation pressing heavily on his shoulders. For once, he didn't stride in like a king surveying his court. He came as a man with nothing left to hide, his resolve stitched not from arrogance, but from something far stronger, truth. And he didn't come alone. Charlize walked beside him. Her gown was simple compared to the jeweled finery around them, but it made her radiant in a way no glitter could dim. She moved with quiet grace, chin lifted though she could feel the sting of eyes upon her. Whispers rose instantly, sharp as knives. Isn't that her? The PA? The one who... But Stephen didn't flinch. He offered her his arm, steady and certain, guiding her toward the center of the room, as though daring anyone to speak against her. Landry stepped forward, his smile sharp enough to cut. "Stephen," he said loudly, drawing every gaze. "So glad you made it. And with your... companion. I suppose this confirms the rumors. Tell me, is it true you let affection cloud your judgment? That your empire now bleeds because of her?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, polite but eager. Paulina's smile curved, triumphant, her eyes fixed on Charlize with venomous delight. Stephen's jaw tightened. For days he had endured this game, but he hadn't been idle. While Charlize's absence tore at him, he had spent sleepless nights pulling every thread. Private investigators, forensic accountants, even Franklin lending his influence to gain access to records. And what they uncovered had been more damning than he'd imagined. He stepped forward, his voice carrying across the hall with the authority of a man unafraid. "Yes," he said, each word deliberate. "My judgment has been changed. By her. But let's address the truth you're so desperate to bury." The room stilled. Stephen lifted a folder from the table beside him, thick with documents, and gestured to the large screen at the front of the gala. At his signal, an aide projected files and photographs for all to see. "These," Stephen announced, his voice sharp as steel, "are communications between Landry and Paulina, conspiring to fabricate evidence against my assistant. Emails, bank transfers, even recordings, courtesy of one of Paulina's own staff." Gasps rippled through the hall as screenshots of messages flashed across the screen. Paulina's elegant mask cracked, her composure faltering as her own words appeared before the investors. "Spread the rumor fast. Once she's gone, Stephen will be too." Landry's smirk vanished as his signature appeared beside falsified contracts, evidence of money trails leading back to shell companies he had established to buy influence. Stephen's tone darkened, unyielding. "You accused Charlize of manipulation. You whispered that she was my downfall. But it was you, both of you, who plotted to destroy not just my reputation, but the integrity of this entire market. And tonight, every one of you can see it for yourselves." The investors shifted, their doubt now recoiling from Stephen and fastening onto his rivals. Paulina's lips trembled before she turned sharply, fury blazing, her heels striking against marble as she fled the hall. Landry stammered, reaching for excuses, but no one listened. Allies stepped back, distancing themselves, their faces hardened with disgust. And Stephen wasn't finished. He turned back to the crowd, his voice steady, but stripped bare of the arrogance he once wore. "If you want a man who hides behind walls, who trades humanity for profit, then I am no longer your choice. But if you want a man who will fight not just for numbers, but for truth, for loyalty, for love, then you already have your answer. Because Charlize is not my weakness, she is my strength, and I will not be ashamed of her." The silence that followed was heavy, charged, alive. Then, slowly, applause began. Uncertain at first, then building, swelling until the hall echoed with it. Investors exchanged looks, many nodding, swayed not by Stephen's power, but by his humility. Stephen turned back to Charlize. The crowd blurred around them. In that moment, there was only her. He reached into his pocket, not for a diamond, not for a symbol of wealth, but for something simpler. A band of silver he had carried, once meant for nothing but a transaction. Now it carried the weight of his heart. "Charlize," he said, his voice raw, trembling not from fear but from devotion. "I can't offer you perfection. I can't promise I'll never falter. But I can promise you this: I will never freeze again. I will never let silence wound you. I don't want you as my assistant or as my shield. I want you as my partner, my equal, my heart. Will you stand with me not in shadows, but in light?" Her breath caught, tears slipping free as the world around them seemed to vanish. For all her life, she had been told to shrink, to serve, to disappear. And now, before the wealthiest, most powerful crowd in the city, the man she loved offered her not chains but wings. She nodded, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Yes." The applause swelled again, but Stephen didn't hear it. He drew her into his arms, kissing her with the passion of a man reborn, no longer afraid of love, no longer ruled by fear. Around them, the empire he had thought was crumbling began to rebuild, not on profit, not on reputation, but on the truth of their bond. And for the first time, Stephen Harrison stood not as a king alone, but as a man complete. Would you have forgiven Stephen if you were Charlize after everything? Or would you have walked away for good? Share your thoughts. I could still feel the weight of the night clinging to me, the flash of cameras, the gasps of investors, the roaring applause that had followed his confession. But here, in the quiet aftermath, it was only Stephen and me. We slipped away from the grand hall, his hand steady at my back, guiding me down corridors bathed in warm lamplight. I could sense his tension unraveling, each step peeling away another layer of the armor he had always worn. For once, he wasn't leading the empire or playing the untouchable mogul. He was simply Stephen Harrison, the man who had nearly lost himself to fear and who now stood before me with nothing but his heart. When the doors to his private study closed behind us, the silence pressed in, tender and fragile. I turned to face him, and his eyes, dark, unguarded, searched mine as though he expected me to vanish. "Charlize," he began, his voice low, breaking in the middle. "I need you to know I wasn't asking you to be mine out of desperation tonight. I was asking you because I finally understood something. I can't stand in the world without you beside me." The sincerity in his tone gripped my chest, but I raised a hand, pressing my fingers gently to his lips. My heart thundered, but I spoke with clarity that came from years of being unseen, unheard. "If I say yes, Stephen, it cannot be as your shadow. I won't go back to being the woman who fetches coffee and fades into the background while everyone else speaks over me. If I am to stand with you, it will be as your equal." His eyes softened, and for the first time, I saw his walls crumble completely. Not the controlled cracks of strategy, but the full collapse of a fortress. His voice was raw when he answered. "I don't want a shadow. I want a partner. You've seen me at my worst, and somehow you still stayed long enough to show me what better could look like. You're not just the woman who saved my empire, you're the woman who saved me." Tears stung my eyes, blurring the edges of his face, but his words reached the deepest part of me, the girl who had been told her life would never amount to more than servitude. That girl trembled, but the woman I had become lifted her chin and whispered, "Then let's save each other." He stepped closer, his hand brushing the dampness from my cheek. "Do you know?" he said, his lips curving into a faint smile. "When you walked into that gala tonight, I thought your gown had stolen my breath. But standing here, I realize it was never the gown. It was your soul. That's what holds me. That's what will always hold me." My breath caught at the reverence in his tone. No one had ever looked at me like that. Not as fragile, not as convenient, not as invisible. He saw me, fully, deeply, dangerously, and I let myself believe. I leaned into him, the warmth of his chest steady beneath my palm. His heart hammered a rhythm against my hand, and when his lips found mine, the kiss wasn't desperate or rushed. It was a vow, a promise sealed in the quiet, in the truth of who we had become. When we finally drew apart, I let out a trembling laugh. "I suppose this means I'm not resigning after all." He chuckled, the sound low and almost boyish. "No, from this moment on, you're not my assistant. You're my partner. In business, in life, in everything that comes." I closed my eyes for a moment, savoring the peace threading through me. After years of being overlooked, after nights of wondering if love was a luxury meant only for others, I finally stood in the light. And he, Stephen Harrison, the man who once swore he'd never let love touch him, stood there with me. We stayed like that, wrapped in quiet certainty, until the world outside seemed to fade. The storm had passed. What remained was us, no longer fractured, no longer afraid, but whole. And for the first time in my life, I knew. I wasn't invisible. I was loved.